In this session we're going to talk about share buybacks, i.e. a company purchase those shares from an existing shareholder. There are a number of important considerations that we need to think about when we buy out the shares of a major or controlling shareholder, because generally speaking the value that we're going to be paying out will be quite substantial. And this may of course have an impact on the company's own financial position, because under the Companies Act rules we have to pay for those shares, i.e. the company has to pay for those shares immediately. So if I was buying back shares in my company, my shares, I'm a controlling shareholder, I'm going to leave my son in charge of the company. So what happens is, at the moment I've got 80 shares, he's got 20 shares. If I do a purchase of shares on my 80 shares, what happens is the company buys back the 80 shares from me, they get cancelled, so the company ends up only having 20 shares, i.e. my son has 100% of the company. But of course what also happens there is that the company's paying me for my 80 shares, and if let's say they're worth $500,000, 500,000, then that value actually will leave the company, i.e. the net asset value of my company will reduce by 500,000. So even though my son will end up having 100% of the company, he ends up having 100% of a much smaller cake. Now I'm coming back to the Companies Act issue, because I think when we're doing a POS transaction for a controlling shareholder, the tax, generally speaking, is relatively simple. We would expect to get capital gains tax treatment, but provided we adhere to the relevant conditions in the legislation, i.e. for the benefit of the trade, I've got to have owned the shares for 5 years, and I can't be connected with the company immediately after the share buyback. But the important thing, as I've already mentioned, is the fact that the company has to pay cash on the now for my shares. So this can be a problem for a company, because it may not be able to borrow 500,000 to buy me out, and therefore we're looking to the asset base of the company to finance that transaction. And very few companies probably have free cash flow of the order of $500,000, and therefore we have to get our thinking caps on to determine how do we actually bridge this problem, financing problem, between the fact that under the Companies Act we have to pay immediately, but on the other hand we haven't got that sort of money. We cannot have therefore deferred consideration transactions, nor can we simply take the money out of the company and lend it back, because if we did that we will be probably breaking the connection test for the capital gains tax buyback treatment. So what has happened in recent years is that many people who are doing these types of transactions have resorted to what we call the multiple completion method, which is totally acceptable as far as the revenue is concerned, and therefore is a legitimate way of effectively deferring the payments for a purchase of those shares. And broadly speaking, the way this works is that, going back to my own example, I sell my shares back to the company under a contract which requires me to sell all my shares back. That therefore means on day one I have legally, for tax purposes, sold my shares, and therefore the capital gains tax on the entire amount of 500,000 will fall due for payment by the 31st of January, following the end of the tax year in which I enter into my buyback contract. However, the buyback contract itself will contain a schedule of multiple completions. In other words, what we're saying is, although I've contracted to sell my shares, I will complete that transaction in a number of stages, and this could be over 2 and 3 years. And what happens therefore is that each year a tranche of my shares on the buyback actually gets completed, and I physically receive the cash for that relevant tranche. The multiple completion method has a number of advantages. One, of course, is that I've effectively mimicked a deferred consideration transaction, because my cash outflow from the company will take place over a number of years. But at each completion date, what happens is we have to go through the Companies Act procedure for buying back that relevant tranche of shares, i.e. we have to pass the appropriate resolution, and we have to send to the Registrar of Companies the appropriate documentation for that element of share buyback. Furthermore, remember that when we buy back shares, it has to be franked by the company's distributable reserves. And therefore what this means is by doing a multiple completion contract, we only have to have sufficient distributable profits to frank the relevant element of the buyback tranche. And therefore, if my 500,000 is carved up into, let's say, £250,000 now, and then £50,000 per year over, let's say, the next few years, then on day one I only need to have £250,000 worth of cash and indeed reserves to deal with my first tranche, and then in the end of year one I only need to have £50,000 worth of surplus cash and indeed reserves to buy back the second tranche, and so it goes on. So this is a very effective way of purchasing shares from the company, but deferring the cash flows and therefore assisting with financing that transaction. One of the stumbling blocks that can be in practice, revenue sometimes argue that even though I've sold my shares and in that contract, the contract says I can't vote on the shares, I can't receive any dividends on the shares, I can't have any capital value on a winding up, etc. My interest is solely in relation to the buyback contract. The revenue do argue that under company law you cannot, as a registered holder of the shares, give away your voting rights. And therefore this could be a problem if you were a significant shareholder and immediately after the first tranche is bought back you still have sufficient shares to have more than 30% of the voting power. But this is often remedied quite easily. The revenue do accept that what you could do immediately after the first tranche is purchased from the company, your shares which are uncompleted can be converted into non-voting shares, and the revenue are quite relaxed about that, and that eliminates completely the connection test problem that you would have immediately after the buyback. So just to sum up then, buyback transactions, when we're dealing with, especially with controlling shareholders and large sums are involved, this will tend to be a financing issue for the company. Very few companies can actually finance that on day one because they haven't got sufficient cash and or indeed retained reserves, but with the use of a multiple completion contract we can actually undertake our buyback over a number of years while still falling within the beneficial tax rules for capital gains tax treatment. Thanks very much.